Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to the October edition of the UCAN working group. And we still have a few folks coming in, but there was already some pre-discussion happening, so I figured I'd hit the record button. I was saying previously, we might have a bit of a lighter week this week, or a lighter call this month, rather. It's not weekly, it's monthly. Because so many folks are at PLN Lab Week, and because of that, I ended up moving the call dates. There wasn't a ton of warning for that, but actually looks like we're getting a still reasonably good turnout here. So maybe to kick things off, Philip, do you want to talk about the thing you just dropped in the chat?
Yeah, so this is something that came up this morning with Brian, who can't make it, and Chris. And essentially, it's about how we handle backwards compatibility. So, or do we, or et cetera, et cetera. So Fission has interest in using RS UCAN for a bunch of things, including the server and web apps. And that doesn't have support for 0.8 UCANs. And essentially, there's we want to ask the room, what do people expect to use? Do they expect to use 0.8 UCANs? Are they going to update to 0.9? I know that Blue Sky is using TS UCAN, and that doesn't have 0.9 support yet. So I don't know, those kinds of things, these things raised. And also Chris has put something else in there, which is also really interesting. Question to the spec authors about to what extent do we think about forward or breaking backwards compatibility in UCAN versions. Yeah, and Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to throw out there, there's sort of two dimensions, like you suggested, to this. One is, UCAN is a rapidly evolving concept. So to the extent we can, we want to have the flexibility. I'm speculating here because I haven't written the spec myself, but I suspect we want the flexibility to be able to adapt it spec-wise to the things that it needs to be, with major changes like we resolve proofs from SIDs, for example. But at the same time, there's a little bit of a back pressure, which is, large changes like that make it, not impossible to migrate, but it makes it harder to migrate, because even if you have the compatibility layer, if you suddenly start asking all of the users, the simple mental model where everything was sort of inlined in the UCAN is no longer true. Now you have to make sure there's synchronization of UCANs across all the places that are working with them. That's definitely a very different proposition from the point of view of the user of the library, right? They may not have accounted for that, or does that mean we need to now have some built-in transport support so that we can support them in generating the correct HTTP request? Because now suddenly you can't just bring all those UCANs along for the ride by inlining them. Sorry, I'm just throwing this out there as sort of the body of questions that start to open up when you start to think about things in terms of how the spec has broken over time, and then what it means to support users migrating from older versions. To sort of sketch around another point I have, which is that to the extent that we don't have to support people migrating into the future today, it's actually a big tailwind for us, a big boost, because it means we can start, we can keep the library moving at pace as we sort of zero in on what UCAN really needs to be. So just throwing that out there.
Lots of thoughts. Am I the moderator? Brooke,
I think, I wonder if we should get through the hands.
Sorry, Brooke, you're muted.
I was holding the space bar, but apparently without window focus. I think maybe we should get through the hands first, or you know what? Let's address this first. I can drop my hand. I'm going to just throw myself into the beginning of the queue then, I guess, on this one. With a little bit of color on that, plus an answer on one of the specific points in there. So I'll just get this one out just to begin with. In point 9, when we move to having the SID table, instead of inlining everything, it says in the spec that you must be able to provide the entire table in your request. There's no requirement in here of having an HTTP endpoint that you query into. The user is required to hand you everything that you require. And if you're on, if you allow them to have, memoized previous versions, things like that, then yep, you need to provide some way of saying like, hey, you didn't give me everything. You need to provide me more stuff. But there's always a way of saying like, here's the whole thing, right? It's just that you're not required to, in all cases. You can still inline things as well by using the identity hash if you want to, but then you're tied into, like you've now lost all those memorizations, right? So that's just like a small point on that specific thing, but the broader question of like, well, how do we do upgrades over time? Because UCANs can be relatively long-lived. There's this question, and it keeps coming up of like, well, how far back do we need to support? Or should we just make every version its own island? And if we are going to draw a line and say, okay, we're going to support up to this version, and then have some compatibility layer in between, we need to make sure that every spec is capable of expressing everything that the previous spec was able to, right? And then have some upgrade path between them, right? When we hit a 1.0, even at that point, we're going to need to have some kind of, my guess is probably want to have some kind of backwards compatibility, because these are sort of like, open, interoperable, relatively long-lived things. But I would also love to hear from the group what they think, and also which, if there's backwards compatibility, what versions they think are important. We're not going to get into that just yet. I'm going to go in order, at least as I see them. Dimitri.
Thanks. Yeah, so this is, as you can probably imagine, this question comes up basically at every data model and protocol, right? So like every standards group wrestles with this. And there's two basic solutions to this. One is versioning and the other one's feature detection. And historically, the feature detection has led to overwhelmingly better results. So I just wanted to provide that piece of history, say if you are thinking of versioning the spec, don't go by the version number, go by feature detection. That's it, thanks.
Awesome, thanks. So we've added version numbers for a while. I agree, actually. Feature detection is because it's just the thing itself. But we're already going down this version path. So, and maybe that's something that we can change going forward even. I think it's still open for discussion. But yeah, as we work through this, the giant line of hands, a lot of people have things to say this time. Michael.
Yeah, I wanted to comment a little bit on the sort of resolving CIDs question. I think that I remember when we were getting CIDs kind of into the spec, and it was not our intention at that time, and still is not, that you would resolve those over a network at any point in time. Maybe like a local network within a data center, but never the idea that you would hit the DHT in order to resolve an auth token is crazy. Nobody should consider doing that. And I think that there's a nice amount of flexibility here in that if you know that a service provider has half of the proof chain, you don't have to keep sending it over and over again. And certain providers may allow you to do that. Right now, our endpoint, if you don't give us the entire proof chain in the request, we'll just deny it. We haven't implemented any of that kind of caching layer, but we will at some point in time, just to make it a little bit more efficient. But I don't think that it's reasonable to expect that anything other than a provider already having the whole proof chain in order to resolve would be reasonable for an authentication system. Yeah, so that's sort of my hot take on it as somebody who's very invested in IPFS, but also just like doesn't see how that would be very useful. And on the sort of upgrading various versions of UCAN stuff, so we shipped with a beta API with the old version of UCANs, and now we're upgrading to 0.9. So we have a little bit of experience right now, kind of moving from one version to the next. And it's a little painful, and we definitely want to get it up as soon as possible. But one thing to note is that, you know, we're going to keep around those proof chains forever. Like those delegations are going to sit in our service forever, and we're always going to have code in some way that interacts with them. So I think that, you know, I've been through this multiple times in different projects that we're all sort of waiting on calling something 1.0 for no real logical reason. Like everyone thinks that they can hold off on something being stabilized until you call it whatever you want to call it. But the reality is, once you ship it, once people are reliant on it, you just have to support it. I think a lot of us may even remember, you know, dealing with Flickr's OAuth forever, which wasn't ever the OAuth spec. It was always like some prior version before the specification actually got finalized. And, you know, we see that across like our whole ecosystem. It's even worse when you're looking at content address data, because once you're referring to things by hash and you have these proof chains that are built on this hash, you just have to keep them around and support it forever. So our work right now is just trying to get to what we feel like is a much more stable version that's in line with how we use it, 0.9, as quickly as possible, so that we sort of don't have to keep supporting 0.8 that much.
Yeah, so do you, and we can follow up offline as well. I believe Daghouse is using 0.8 as the oldest, is that right?
Yeah, that was what we shipped the beta with, but 0.9 I think went out this week. So I think that we have 0.9 now in production. So.
Amazing, awesome. Chris.
I'd like to reframe my comments a little bit, because I think I said something about the delta between 0.8 and 0.9 and how UCANs are referred to by SIDS, and everybody got excited about that. But it actually isn't what I'm trying to call out. Because I think, yeah, what you said, Michael, is fine. And that's exactly how I feel about it. The problem isn't that. The problem is when we go and rewrite this back and we've got 0.8 live and extant, and we think, okay, now we're going to do 0.9 and we're going to change some detail of the spec in some major way. My sort of open-ended question is, to what extent are we looking at that change and being like, hey, there's a bunch of people out in 0.8. What does the migration path look like for them? And what does the compatibility path look like for library authors? Because if I start to break it down, like what would it mean for me, like just in isolation, if I had a bunch of stuff in 0.8 on clients and servers, like all trying to interop, and I wanted to actually create a concrete, like forward-facing migration path, it's actually not trivial. It's like, you know, there's like a lot of logistics around like switching from having inline stuff to, you know, moving things into HTTP requests, and not all of it is within the boundary of what the library author is necessarily like offering to the user. So there's a lot of coordination involved. So I think I'm just trying to point a finger at, like, you know, I think there's a little bit of, you know, not, you know, deliberate, but, you know, kind of collateral complexity that gets introduced by these types of breaking changes. And so to the extent that backwards compatibility seems like a must-have, and, you know, granted, I think the more people who just are using it, like Daghouse, if Daghouse, you know, says, yeah, we're going to have these 0.8 UCANs that live forever, and we always have to support them no matter what, like that creates a really big pressure, you know, to enable backwards compatibility. And the thing that actually says to me is like, well, whether you have a 1.0 of UCANs or not, you know, you've got a version of the spec that is broadly propagated and basically has to be supported. And I mean, that means every time you think about a new breaking change to UCAN, you're going to go back all the way to the thing that you think is broadly propagated and needs to be supported. Sorry, I know Brooke is nodding, and I know that she probably doesn't need to hear any of this from me, but I'm just kind of saying it out loud to the room, because this is what's coming up for me in thinking about backwards compatibility issues. And it's sort of contrasted with the fact that, as far as I know, nobody's using RSUCAN today except for us and Fission. That doesn't mean that there isn't an opportunity for DAGhouse to pick up RSUCAN in the future. But I guess the flip side, not the maintainer question, sorry, the spec writer question, but for the library user, like, how do you think about forward migration into the future, you know, with all this older stuff? Because it seems untenable over the long run for us to always have like support for 0.8 UCANs if we get to, you know, version like 3 or 4 UCAN. And then we're trying to like maintain backwards compatibility to infinity.
So I can speak to that a little bit, and one possible strategy that could be adopted, right? But there's you're right that there's this extra pressure to then also make changes less frequently, right? Because we don't want to have like a 0.10, 11, 12, 13 every week, right? Because now there's all these different slight variations that you need to account for. Absolutely, right? And that's, I think, a big part of why 0.9 was the process that it was to get it out, right? It's like, we're like, are we sure we want these things, right? And we'd like really talk about it because it's painful every time. The strategy that we at least took in, and you know, as the author of the least used by far UCAN library, or the original one, Philip then took it much further after. The general strategy that you can take is to have an intermediate representation that you essentially tear down the existing UCAN, put it into a consistent format, and then you can start to, you validate the signature, of course, and that is structurally sound. You tear it down into a consistent format, and then you do all the semantic checking on that, right? So now what you have is, yep, you've got the cryptographic stuff that happens first, because you have to have the literal bits, right? But now you have a translation from 0.3 to the intermediate representation 0.7, 0.8, 0.9. And once you're in that consistent thing, then you can do direct and only have to do this translation once, and then you can run the automated checker on that. We have been, hopefully, I'd love to know if we've like actually broken something. Careful to only have things that can be expressed to make it more powerful, never less powerful as we're moving forward. And to say, we're only going to add features, and you could always have, even if it was some like weird, you know, backwards way of writing it, that you could have written the old version in the new version, or at least the things that it's expressing, right? And so we can always go down to this consistent format. So that's one option. That does constrain the architectural choices that you make inside of the library to do this for when you care about backwards compatibility. It is a model that has worked for us. I'm sure that's not the only one. The problem with doing like a 0.7 to 0.8, 0.8 to 0.9, and so on, is that sometimes you need to go from a 0.3 to a 0.9, right? So these larger jumps. Something that inside of Fission that we, and I think actually worked its way into the spec, is to say that you can only delegate into higher numbered specs, or into higher number UCANs. So you can't delegate from a 0.9 to a 0.3, right? We'll just not allow that. So at least it's only going one way to kind of lower the amount of total possible states. But I would love to hear more in like a lot of detail, actually, like you know, let's get into like the nitty gritty of like all the ways in which this is painful, so that we can make it as unpainful as possible going forward, given that it sounds like we will have backwards compatibility. Now, Philip, you had your hands now down. Did I cover the thing you were going to talk about? Basically, okay.
Yeah, for the most part.
Charles.
Hi, I'm new on this call. I work for Spruce Systems. We have been using UCAN in one of our projects, and we also have an implementation within our Rust SSI library. So we originally implemented 0.8.1, and then I saw the PR for 0.9, and then had sufficiently good changes that were not backwards compatible that we decided to basically just do that first. And so those changes, I think there are some changes that are just not backwards compatible enough that if you want to implement them, you'll just have to accept that you can't maintain that compatibility. It seems to me like the main problem is creating chains where old versions might refer to newer versions going backwards, which would cause bigger problems. But basically keeping everything that creates UCANs consistently upgrading in version would mitigate some of that. I think there's problems, but I wasn't concerned with making those breaking changes, but also I hadn't actually deployed anything that was being accessed by anyone with 0.8. Yeah.
Awesome. That's really good context. And yeah, on the delegating to a lower version, I'm pretty sure, I'm like 99% sure it's like actively disallowed in the spec to do that. And the other thing, actually, Chris, that I'd wanted to mention was, in terms of like, people using UCAN versus other things, like obviously it's a token spec. So it could be like across these libraries. In fact, ideally it's across these libraries. The real question is, of the people that are using the particular code, are they able to interop? Right? So if today it's fission and subconscious, and we agree that we're only going to do 0.9 and above, that's probably sufficient until somebody complains, right? So it's one of the things that I keep coming back to is like the whole point of a standard is just to say like, what's the minimal thing that we can all agree on that we need in order to interoperate? Otherwise, it's an application, not a standard, right? Philip.
Yeah, in terms of there's like two things to the compatibility story here. One is like for let's say a library author, which UCANs does the library support to generate, and which UCANs does the library support to ingest and verify and check or use as proofs. And by saying that we make the UCAN the UCAN versions along the delegations monotonically increasing in version, we make it possible to say that libraries should just give you the most recent version of UCANs, and proofs can be something older. And then the other thing that we as spec authors, in order to kind of answer the question from the original discussion comment that you posted, Chris, we as spec authors will then make sure that UCANs get more expressive over time across the versions, because that makes it possible to have an internal representation of a UCAN that can encompass an older version of a UCAN, if that makes sense. And yeah, so I think that's basically the plan for UCANs. And just one thing I wanted to notice, yeah, we just can't really do much else than versions, and like we can't do sorry, what was it? Negotiation or
Feature detection.
Feature detection, yeah, that's really hard to do, because you end up having like certificates from other nodes or from some other machine that you can't regenerate, and it forces you into a certain byte format or encoding format, and there's just no way around that. So yeah.
Chris.
I just want to emphasize, in case it sounds like I was coming off kind of strong against ideas around backwards compatibility, that I'm in favor of backwards compatibility. And I also agree that it's somewhat easy to imagine how to enable backwards compatibility, especially from a proofreading perspective. Like, I'm not concerned like that's going to be a big burden on me as a library author, or burden on the library in terms of its complexity. I think I just have sort of a broad set of, I guess concerns is the right word, around, sort of the trajectory of this body of work, UCANs overall. It's sort of nascent stage, relatively speaking, and whether or not backwards compatibility is the right thing to be optimizing for in this moment. And it's not yeah, I said in the Discord to folks at Fission, you know, I'm more than happy to take in compatibility layers and all of that stuff. So not controversial to me at all, to enable backwards compatibility with older versions of UCAN. I think the thing that's missing for me, and hopefully, you know, on this call we can maybe illuminate it a little bit, is like, are there people who would even benefit from it? Because like, why even support? And it sounds like maybe DAG House would, but really the situation we're talking about is someone is using RSUCAN to work with DAG House, and they need to parse old versions of UCAN from DAG House. And maybe it's DAG House, maybe it's somebody else. And so I guess I'm just generally curious, like, is that a real human that we're talking about, or a fictional one in our minds?
So there's definitely real human cases. Going back to point 3, we dropped support for the last time that we tried to cut a 1.0, which was a mistake. It was way too early for that, and we had to migrate a bunch of our users to the updated spec. And luckily, at the time, I'll say arguably still, they're inside of our one system, there aren't enough people that are depending on it, like in production day to day, right? At Fission, where we can do that. We can just say like, yep, cool. We're just going to upgrade you to the latest version. We're going to change your root key for the DNS that we managed for you. That's fine. Here's your updated account. Please start issuing new UCANs, and that all works. The harder part comes when we have all these different organizations trying to interact, and they have users, and their users have users, right? That we need to keep these things around. So it is absolutely a good conversation to have and to ask these questions. And in case it, in the same way that you're saying that, you don't want to seem like it's, you're coming across against backwards compatibility or something. I don't want to seem like we're against having these open discussions about these things. These are important discussions to have, right? And to do these things intentionally. Having, even deciding where we're going to draw the line for version number, I'm pretty sure Fission has the oldest UCANs around, and we are comfortable just upgrading our users to 0.9 or 0.8 or whatever the line is that we need to draw in the sand, right? For this stuff. But we won't be able to do that forever, right? So like we will definitely need some sort of compatibility mode over time. Deciding what that number is, I think is important. And I've actually been thinking a little bit recently. It's interesting that 1.0 has come up in this call of like getting to the point where this is starting to slow down enough that like maybe the next version we get some stuff in and say like we're going to do a big process, get whatever we need to get in, clean up whatever we need to get cleaned up, and then make the human signaling decision of 1.0, even though we still have to maintain things earlier, but like that is a signal, right? That like this thing is now going to stick around, that we can now use the .1 after that to say, and this is backwards compatible, even though it's a new version, right? And all of these things, and kind of get onto that process. But I think that's a bigger discussion than me just kind of like saying it in passing. Does that make sense, Chris?
Yeah, it all makes sense. I think it's worth having the discussion about, if you have an existing user and you have an existing set of UCANs, and there's an existing library that was out there to support them, like tactically speaking, what's the lever that you need to pull in order to actually move them into the future? I think, I made a big change to RSUCAN to get us part of the way to 0.9, and it included breaking changes, and we got 0 issues on GitHub from people who said that we broke them, right? So I think that speaks a lot to sort of the relative, propagation of people using UCANs and what libraries are they using, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just something to think about as we go through this process. And I think, zeroing in on something that's got, more stability to it, which suggests something about its longevity. I don't want to call it a 1.0, but, something in that vein it seems like a better target for us to shoot for collectively, especially if we're talking about like we're sticking stuff on, you know, the IPFS data graph and it's going to live forever, right? We want those things to be, you know, not forward facing things necessarily, but like things that we know are a concrete target that we want to all collectively agree to support. So.
Yeah, totally. I think probably if we were to totally break backwards compatibility on TS-UCAN, there probably would be more issues filed. To kind of give you a sense of our internal strategy, and then Alan, I promise I will get to your hand, to give you at least inside of Fission. So we are upgrading all of our tooling into Rust right now, right? So like it's been a smattering of different languages and different tools. We're just Rustifying everything. And one of the questions is, well, you know, RS-UCAN doesn't support really old versions of UCAN. What now, right? And should we go and add 0.3 compatibility to RS-UCAN? And the answer is hell no, right? In no world are we going to do that. Let's expose the existing tools that handle those things and upgrade all of our users, and then replace that once we have, because we have a server and a CLI, they need to be both on the same version, right? Once we have both of those with 0.9 support, then we can rip the thing out, right? And see who complains, right? Or switch it, have a flag that we switch it off and just see if it's a problem, right? But like, we're not going back in and doing all of that work that far back. So it's definitely, it's a pain we've felt as well of like, well, where's the line? It sounds like so far on the call, 0.8 is the place, but anyhow, Alan.
With eSpeak, we had the unfortunate problem of having customers before we'd settled on the architecture. And so the way we handled that was the initial handshake. Each side specified the versions that they supported. And typically our customers would support 3. I think that the most was 4. And we had like 8 because we were evolving so quickly. But they would find a match and then they could communicate. If they couldn't find a match, they might find somebody who could do the protocol matching for them, another service. And that was part of our whole design. But the idea that you could support multiple versions until your customers could upgrade to the newer ones proved useful, especially in that very dynamic environment. Now, we didn't know about Semver. We hadn't heard about that, but that would have dramatically simplified the matching.
Yeah, really good context and good to know.
Yeah. I want to add a comment to what we end up doing ourselves in terms of upgrades. So we are upgrading to 0.9 and we left another endpoint for 0.8. And idea is that we validate with the old code, but then call the new handler, which has the same API, which doesn't need to deal with the UCANs anymore, which seems to work fairly nicely.
How do you handle an A0.8 UCAN within the delegation chain of a 0.9 UCAN? So there is an invocation, it uses a 0.9 UCAN, but the proof is a 0.8 UCAN.
I think that's not possible. Even spec says that like you cannot do that, right? Like, or maybe it was the other way around.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess we do not. We don't have a code that deals with that problem, so I'm not exactly sure what will happen. Probably it will just not work.
So
Which
something
UCAN
we're
library?
Good point.
Are you using TS-UCAN?
We are you asking me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, we don't use TS-UCAN. We use DAG UCAN that we've implemented.
Okay. Awesome.
Yeah, I think one thing to point out here is that because all of our stuff is using all of the IPLD tooling and doing everything in car files and all that, we actually have like a fair amount of code that sits in the codec layer and can kind of swap between an underlying binary representation and an in-memory representation that kind of differ. So there's a lot of flexibility that we have in that tool chain that just may not exist in other tool chains where you're mapping much more directly to the JSON. So you know, some of what we can do may not be a good case study for the rest of the ecosystem in that regard. So I wouldn't I wouldn't read too much into it.
Yeah, and I think it's also, we never actually used some of the features that got removed in 0.8. So even when we get 0.9 decons, it would not contain like my capabilities and stuff like that. So that made it easier.
Yeah, and it actually ends up sounding a lot like the intermediate representation thing that we ended up doing in HSUCAN, at least in an old version as well. So yeah, makes sense. Chris.
I just wanted to observe that I think they're, you know, kind of maybe being more optimistic about all this. Like there's a lot of room, I think, for us to imagine compatibility as sort of decoupled from the core libraries also. So it seems like there's a pathway to take older UCANs and sort of deconstruct them and make them into artifacts that are processable by a library that understands 0.9 UCANs without necessarily directly coordinating with that library. Not that that's ideal, because I think there may be some, you know, extra work involved in doing it that way, but it at least seems like it lends credibility to the tractability of this problem, I guess.
I believe this is kind of how Stripe using or had been using. They keep the old APIs around, but they deploy the adapter when they release a new one that does the translation. And that's kind of had been inspiration for like us having two versions to go.
I mean, does anyone think that the next version being the 1.0 is like a bad idea? Is that like a good sort of goal to be? Okay, I think that there's like a consensus then on marching towards that as the next sort of incremental update.
Amazing. I love that happened organically.
So I had one thing to bring up, but I didn't want to push anything off the agenda that was already there. So okay, yeah. So we'd like to publish some of our protocols that are sort of in UCAN for doing uploads and things like that. At this stage, they're much more on UCAN than on anything else, and so it makes a lot of sense to be publishing them sort of in a space around UCAN rather than other spaces that people might like to see us publish them in. And we definitely need them somewhere, you know, more sort of public and neutral than Gonzalo's HackMD, which is great. I love Gonzalo's HackMD, but I don't think that other people are going to implement them while it's in there. So yeah, I was just wondering, I know that we've talked about before sort of having an area where some of that stuff can live. Is there any sort of bottleneck on just getting something up for people to throw stuff in and start experimenting?
What rights do you need to the UCAN working group, and I will grant them.
Gonzalo would need them. I don't need them.
I already have rights, but yeah,
I guess just where to put them, right?
Yeah, so the pattern that we've followed so far that's been at least reasonably successful, there are other ways of doing this, right? Is create a repo in the UCAN working group. It doesn't even have to be super formal. Like there's two in there right now that are essentially like placeholders, almost like a signaling of intention that we're going to do UCAN Cacao and breaking out the canonicalization spec from the IPLD, UCAN IPLD into its own thing, so that people don't have to necessarily depend on the rest of the IPLD stuff in there, which has been requested a few times. But in the meantime, people can just kind of like look at that section. It doesn't have to be super formal, right? You just like in the README, copy it out of the HackMD, drop it in there, and then people can open issues, discussions, etc., specific to that subspec. The other two ways of doing this, I guess, is you could create a discussion in the main spec repo, or create a wiki. I think starting from a document that then people can PR against and have discussions about every change into it has been successful in UCAN and a few of the other working groups, like the Web Native File System working group and a few others as well. Yeah, don't be too precious with it is I think what I'm trying to say. Irakli, on that topic before we get to Chris, you had unmuted at one point. Was there something you wanted to?
Yeah, so a couple of things. So one, my HackMDs are actually documents in a spec, Web3 storage spec repo, but we can move them elsewhere. So it was one, and the other one was, I think what Michael is talking about is not necessarily like UCAN specification, but more of a like set of capabilities as a way of like, can we converge onto similar capability set for specific thing rather than having different names and different encodings, which I think might be useful, especially over time as base grows.
Yeah, so resources and abilities, right? And having at minimum a cookbook for these is a long requested thing. I would love for somebody to take that on, like really. We've had a bunch of one-on-one calls about that, at least Irakli and I, about like, well, what are the things that could be like the minimum sets that everyone supports? I think there's two parts there, right? There is a cookbook version. I also wouldn't mind having some of them, like the minimum set, as a not in the core UCAN, but like as a spec to say like, hey, we at least supply the standard lib, right? Which is like CRUD actions and I don't know, like things like that you can send and receive, right? Which you can apply to lots of different things. And then presumably all the major libraries would adopt that and it would become essentially a de facto part of the main system, right? Cookbook, I think, is also an interesting direction, separate from that or related but separate. So that you can say like, well, if you have something that isn't covered by the standard lib, how would you go about it, right? Because we don't want to constrain a system to not work for a particular project just because it doesn't happen to not be in the standard lib, right? So, and all the trade-offs that comes with. But that's my personal take on it. It doesn't have to be just whatever I say. Chris, then Philip.
I think most of my question was actually answered, but I just wanted to clarify. So like for extra things, this is sort of like more in the cookbook category of stuff that y'all are talking about. I think that is basically what you said. And then since it's kind of on the thread that we're talking about, I wanted to throw out there, particularly for Daghouse, in the recent version of RSUCAN that we released, we implemented most of the support for the UCAN IPLD spec. And I put up an issue asking if there were like conformance tests or anything along those lines to verify that we're doing it correctly. And in lieu of that, I was kind of curious, do y'all have like tests or like fixtures or anything along those lines that maybe you'd be willing to share, just so that we can get sort of a smoke test of like how well we did, or if you have time and interest in Rust, like kick the tires on the change and let me know if I did it all wrong. So that's sort of an open-ended ask. And I have another question too, but directed at Daniel after Irakli has a chance to respond.
Yeah, so I believe we do test against a default set that is part of spec, but that mostly exercises a JWT parsing and serializing. And we test against data sets that was in TS UCAN. We do test like the DAG UCAN works, but we don't like materialize the data set out of it. But I'd be delighted to do so. Mostly we didn't do it because there was no other library. So like instead of using fixtures, we just test that things come out the way we expect them. But I'd be happy to kind of turn that into a data set so we can.
I mean, maybe the shortest path is to just pick up your library and generate stuff and then try to read it or something.
Yeah, that's what I meant by generating a data set.
Okay, cool.
Or actually, like I probably the best thing would be to take the data sets that exists and kind of generate out of it the DAG UCAN representations and maybe add it to the IPLD spec that is there. That way we'll have it there.
Yeah, that would be awesome, honestly, because then we wouldn't have to necessarily cooperate directly to validate our expectations.
Cool.
And for Daniel, I'm actually curious. I know you guys are big users of TS UCAN, but is there a vision in the future for the work y'all are doing around possibly integrating Rust anywhere in your stack? And just ask generally, just trying to set my expectations around possible future users.
Yeah, can you hear me all right? I've been having audio issues. Okay, sweet. No, we don't really have any plans around Rust right now. We will be rewriting our personal data server implementation in some systems language. It might be Go because we have more experience with that on the team. It might be Rust, but I wouldn't bet on it. And at that point, we'll be either putting some work into a Go UCAN library or Rust UCAN if we do go that route. But for the foreseeable future, it's going to be TypeScript and TS UCAN.
Is there, how open would you be to using a WASM blob?
If my last experience with WASM didn't go that well and it caused me a lot of headaches, if it's very easy to drop it in and we're off to the races, then I would not be opposed to that. But I don't know. I'm a little bit cautious about like pulling WASM into the tool chain for UCANs and nothing else.
Yeah, totally fair.
Yeah.
We could do a Go bindings for RS UCAN maybe.
There we go.
Yeah, I think Go is pretty good at actually binding to the standard libs, and Rust can produce those, so it should be not so bad. Like, I mean, C libraries. For what it's worth, JS.DAG UCAN is, while it produces IPLD, it also does JWT as well. So in a future where WASM might be an only option, that you might consider that too.
Okay, nice. And also for the backwards compatibility discussion, I'm very in support of a 1.0 soon. And we don't have any code in production and we don't have any 0.8 UCAN circling around. And so I'm not terribly worried about the upgrade path to 0.9 for us.
Awesome. All right, so we have about just over 10 minutes left. I think as unless people have other things they want to talk about after this, I'm just going to sort of summarize really quickly here. Sounds like we're going to, oh, please.
Can I mention one thing before you do summary? I think before we do 1.0, it would be nice if at least some of us have an interop in practice so we can check that it's actually working and discover all the problems we might do the process. And once that's working, we can call it the 1.0.
Yeah, absolutely. And that actually falls really well into the next steps, I think, as well. So I think a 1.0 is probably going to be in the same way that 0.9 was I think before you joined the call directly, I called it a bit of a process, which I think you might agree. I think a 1.0 will also be sort of like this, like us really taking a hard look at the thing and saying like what goes in, what goes out. So it sounds like next steps. We open a discussion for a 1.0, which would probably be quite a long running thread. Perhaps even start a branch that we can start discussing directly rather than the discussion thread. At least some of us should do direct interop. I know that Fission is very eager to do a Fission DAG house interop, and also Efficient Blue Sky once that is all. Well, so actually, Daniel, Blue Sky did a big announcement recently. So A, congrats. That's amazing. Two,
Thank you.
is it up and running? Is there a service that we can connect into?
There is not a service up and running yet. I'm cautious to give any timelines, but here
Totally
pretty
fine.
soon. It's soon.
Awesome. But also, Chris, we would be more than happy to do a subconscious integration. We're also looking, pretty deeply at your stuff as a target for WinFS as well, right? So like, there's lots of stuff in that direction that Fission would like to plug into, and the main point of UCAN is that it should be able to cross these system boundaries. So like, totally good thing to bring up, Rackley. Also, maybe something that we could talk about. I assume you're in Lisbon right now. Is that? Yeah. So we should get together and just talk about like what that connection is like. And I'd also encourage other folks to see if they can do direct bridges as well. Yeah. So those things, getting 0.9s versions of libraries out the door. And the other thing, it sounds like 0.8 is going to be the line in the sand for backwards compatibility, which is kind of roughly where, at least inside internally at Fission, we were thinking probably this would end up. So we're going to upgrade all of our users to 0.9 sort of post haste as soon as we can. Just like Daniel, I will also not give timelines on that. So beyond that, is there anything else that we should add to the to-dos and the follow-up notes?
I do not know like how Kakao relationship is being sort of, or whether it should block 1.0, but that might be worth getting the input from the folks interested in it.
So we have at least one here. And any thoughts?
Even from our side, from Ceramic side, Kakao side. Well, I don't know. What's the timeline for moving to 1.0? Expected timelines. Oh,
You're
is it
muted,
me?
Broke.
Yep.
Sorry, I would guess. I mean, we just brought up the topic at all just now. I would say some number of months is probably not going to happen before the end of the calendar year, because nothing ever gets done in December, right? Which is coming shockingly fast. So let's say sometime early next year, probably. It's just kind of throwing a dart at a dartboard estimate. Also, I created a repo that's completely empty right now called UCAN Kakao. I don't see any reason why we can't map between the two already. We just need to define the mapping and then add the attributes or the abilities parts to the capability in Kakao. Though I also saw something very recently from Spruce where that is also in their token, their new upgraded token as well.
Yep. Well, I think formerly known as CapGrok.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
So-
we're actually renaming that to be Recap. Just to make it clear.
Yeah.
Great name, by the way.
Thanks.
Yeah. Well, so with that timeline, I think we can finally make that interop bridge between them.
Amazing.
Yeah, time flies shockingly fast.
Awesome. And Sergey or Charles, are either of you in Lisbon this week?
I am not.
No? Okay.
I'm not either.
Okay, that's fine. There's PLN Lab Weekend, some Ethereum event as well. So I was wondering, maybe, see who's around, but it's fine. Awesome. So yeah, I guess that goes on the follow-ups as well. Kakao, which then also plugs into Siwi too. So that's another bridge for us to look into.
So there might be also some interest from the protocol labs and IPFS, specifically in UCAN. I've been having interesting conversations in Lisbon, and it seems like they're interested in trying to get them for certain things. So that's might be also worth considering. But yeah, right now it's like just discussions, so I don't know.
Yeah, also hitting a 1.0, I think will be good signaling for like, when is it ready to put inside of other protocols? The other thing that I would love to, since we mentioned pulling stuff out of Rackley's HackMD, and it's actually for another working group, but is I think still related here, is UCAN invocations relating to IPVM. I think there's some maybe pulling those discussions into the IPVM space a little bit more as well. We've started doing more writing about that, like more in earnest, quite recently. Yeah, it would be good to take whatever learnings we can and dropping them over there. Cool. Does anybody else have things they'd like to talk about in the last couple of minutes here? Or should I give you all 3 minutes back? All right. Thanks, everyone. I'll see you all next month. I'll see a few of you this week in Lisbon. Philip and Chris, thank you so much for bringing up the discussion about backwards compatibility and what should be supported in the libraries. Is super important discussion. I'm going to post the notes and obviously the video as soon as it becomes available from Zoom. Chris, would you have the time to write up kind of like the summary of that and maybe the strategy? I think it'd be good to capture that in writing for other libraries as well.
Sorry, could you be a little bit more specific, or maybe we can talk about it offline? I'm happy to write up anything, but the specific details would be nice.
Just literally what we talked about on this call, like what is a good strategy for supporting previous versions? Should we put them down into an IR versus some other strategy? Things like that we're only going to support 0.8, etc. And I'll also capture some extra notes from this call too.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I have a lot of ideas around possibilities. I don't have like a specific path that I think is great, and so maybe we can talk about it a little bit in Discord first, and then I'll write something up.
Awesome, thanks. I'll stop the video now.